My name is Nicole Cagna. I live in South Carolina, and I'm going to talk about how God makes beauty from ashes. I was raised in a Pentecostal church as a born again Christian. We were Italian. My grandmother's from Italy, so we used to get together every Sunday, and we were loud, of course, being Italian, and we laughed, and we just had a togetherness and a fun. I didn't know if I wanted to be a mother. I was an academic, as an educator and a master's in social policy. And so I always liked being a career person. And so I decided to travel and do some of the things that I wanted to do. And then I met my husband and we wanted to spend some time alone together. It was whirlwind. We met and married under 9 months, and we spent some time together getting to know each other, building our relationship as one. And he wasn't sure either if he wanted to have kids. He always said it was my decision, and either or, he was fine either way. And then there came a point where that knock on the door, the desire, it came suddenly. And so I sat down with my husband and I said, this is what I'm feeling. I feel this desire. And so we tried the natural way. He was on board with it. And I think I thought it was going to be like the movies, where you just try and you think within 3 times, here we are. But after the first year, I was a little concerned. And then when we hit the second year, I said to my husband, I think we both need to be tested. When we discovered that there was male infertility factor as well as a clogged fallopian tube from a miscarriage that I didn't know that I had. I remember feeling that I was pregnant early on, and I thought I was crazy. Maybe I was imagining it. And so there was a comfort in the sense that I knew that at least I felt correctly that there was a baby there that I had lost. But then there was the grieving of that baby, and there wouldn't even be an IUI. The doctor went straight to IVF because he said with one tube, we need to be aware. We have to do this, so it takes. And there's no sense in spending energy and time and hormones on something we know that won't work. And so he ended up suggesting IVF right away. And there was some grieving of what we thought it would look like at that point. It had been several years, and we had just started getting crushed. When we first went to IVF, the doctor was extremely supportive and extremely solid that because everything was okay with my uterus, that this was not going to be that it would take the first time, and it did. But I have to be honest, the journey there was the most excruciating level of pain. So after going through needles in the stomach and all sorts of hormone pills, then, you have embryos that are created. And when that happens, that is a surgery. And then they take the embryos out. And then another surgery happens when you take more hormones and they place them back in. I felt definitely not logical. I felt like I was crazy at times. The hormones had me going all over the place. And I just remember thinking it'll be worth it in the end because we talked about putting 2 babies in. We had prayed on it. We went through one cycle and it took. I felt like, Lord, what's wrong with me? So I found out I was pregnant. I was so excited. I announced it all over Facebook at the time. And I remember just getting so excited, and the levels were double. So we knew that there were twins, and we didn't know if there was a boy or a girl yet, according to the ultrasound. But I just remember just feeling this elation. The day that life changed, I was with my mother, and I'm so grateful I took her with me. At the time, my husband was teaching, and I remember I took her with me, and we were going to our first gender reveal ultrasound. And we were so excited. We were giggling, and we were there, and I saw the technician, and she's doing the ultrasound, and she's laughing with us, right? It's like this joyous moment. And I said to her, she goes, so I see that you have 2 boys. And I remember I said to her, look again, because I remember what we prayed. And she said, no, I see 2 boys. And I said, look again. And at the 3rd time, she went, oh, wait a minute. And I just knew. She went, it's a girl. And she's smiling. And all of a sudden, I'll never forget her face. She went like this. She went from to, and she's doing this. And she went, and she's stuttering. And I said, what's wrong? Is something wrong? And she went, excuse me a minute. And she says, I have to get specialist. When the specialist walked in the room, her face spoke volumes that words never can. And all I remember is her saying, I am so sorry, but based on what we see, your daughter has trisomy 13. And it's not just trisomy 13, a random case in the sense of that it's a light version. There's different extents of trisomy 13. She says, this is the worst case I ever saw. And when she said those words, I said, well, what do you mean? And she goes, what I mean is she's incompatible with life. I suggest a partial reduction. And I said, do you mean the euphemism for aborting my daughter? And she said, yes. I said, why? And she said, because I told you she's incompatible with life. And I said, no. I said, is there any harm to me or my son? And she said, no, not at all. I said, then I am not going to do that. And I said, I want to give the Lord time to heal her. Who knows what can happen? Things get diagnosed all the time, and I see stories where the baby ends up just fine. Let's give it time. And she said to me, well, if that's your decision, then I refuse to monitor her. And I said, you work for me in this instance. You will monitor her the way you monitor my son. And she says, that's detrimental to your mental health. I said, I'll decide what I can handle because I'm a mother. And so she put her head down and then she left the room. And I remember my mother and I were quiet. We went from laughing in the car to complete silence. And I was driving my car, and I'll never forget, I was staring, and then this guttural cry came out of me that I didn't know was possible. It was felt like the death of hope. It felt like the death of joy. And I said, this makes no sense. She was fine. That wasn't our first ultrasound. They were growing beautifully. What happened? And they found that as they continued the ultrasound prior to getting back in the car, she had a hole in her heart, a hole in her skull, 6 toes, 6 fingers, and half of a lung. And so I just remember thinking to myself, I know what to pray for at least. But on the way home, I let out a scream that my mother said, oh, honey, pull over. You have to pull over. And we pulled over, at least according to my memory, because it's just such a fog. I was shaking and these cries just echoed. And I look back now and I realize that as a mother, her heart was breaking to see her baby girl cry like that, to grieve and to scream in a way that she never heard me scream before, and to cry in a way that she's never seen me cry before. And in that car, there were 2 moms grieving that day. And it was the worst trip home. And then to have to tell my husband was where it really became hard. I got home and my mother said, I'll stay with you as long as you need and until he comes home. And he was tutoring and working 2 jobs. And I remember he walked in the door with this big grin. And I remember thinking, this is the last time we're going to smile like this. It felt like it was foreshadowing of what was to come. And he looked at my face and he said, what happened? And I just lost it. I couldn't even get out the words through the tears. And I said, it's our daughter. She has trisomy 13. And he began to cry and we held hands and we both looked at each other. And I said, I believe God's going to heal her. And he said, I believe the same. We're going to pray in that direction. And I just remember saying to the Lord, give me strength for every ultrasound. Because now I had to go get an ultrasound every single week. And each week I looked at my daughter's features or lack thereof. And I began to have nightmares. I began to have nightmares of a malformed baby that I couldn't save. I remember in the dreams trying to protect her and falling and failing. And it went from celebrating the babies to going into warrior mode once again. And there I was having to fight for something again. I felt like somebody just put me in the middle of something I couldn't control, something that I had no way to get out of, in the sense that to fix, I researched everything there was. And in faith, I said, you know what? We're going to set up her nursery. We had 2 rooms. After the edema, the fibromyalgia, all the pain, and then having to go on bed rest because I was having so many Braxton Hicks. And they were very concerned that the babies were going to be born premature. And so the day that everything shifted was, I remember feeling like, I had to use the bathroom. And so we had an old Victorian house in New York before we moved to South Carolina 5 years ago. And I remember going to the blue tile. I remember looking at this baby blue tile. And as I'm sitting, using the bathroom, I'm looking at this blue tile and I'm thinking to myself, I stopped feeling like I was urinating, but I stopped using the bathroom. And the next thing you know, I looked down and there's blood. And when I say there's blood, this was not water breaking. This was hemorrhaging. And I remember calling Chris. Yelled his name. And the cats are meowing. They're at the door, of course, because, they're just involved in everything. And I just remember just yelling. I felt this strong urge. And I said, get my iron pills. He comes in, he's rushing, he says, what? I am nonstop bleeding. It is not slowing down. And I remember thinking in that moment as I was getting dizzier, and I felt just completely that feeling of fading in a way. And I downed, I can't tell you how many iron pills. And I thought, well, red looks better than baby blue. There was just that weird, strange thought when you're beginning to disassociate and you're beginning to feel like you're fading. And I said, you have to take me. I have no time for an ambulance. I won't make it. So he gets me, and we wrapped towels and stuff around me. And I was like, let's go, like speed, whatever it takes. So I get to the hospital, we finally get there, and we have nurses that just are like, check in. And my husband's like, you don't understand. My wife is hemorrhaging. She's hemorrhaging. Well, it's normal. No, you don't understand, he's saying. And, he's way more, I would say, the way he approaches something is a lot more calm. So I just was like, hey, I'm like yelling. I said, I'm hemorrhaging. Hello. Like we don't have time for this, nice stuff. Well, now the blood's on the hospital floor, and there is a doctor that just happens to walk by, and he's like, what? And he looked at the nurse and he's like, why is she sitting here? And so now there's this chaos. So now I'm in real trouble. And I remember them saying, we're going to have to do an emergency C-section. And I thought, oh, great. Because I did not want that. I wanted to experience, I don't know why, but it's just like a natural vaginal birth. For some reason, I just did not want all my organs taken out or any of that. I just kind of wanted to be back on my feet, ready to take care of the babies. But I saw that I didn't even know if I was going to live. And I remember they couldn't find the spot to give me a spinal tap. So I remember shaking because I was getting colder and colder. And I'll never forget, there was all this noise and this movement. And I felt like I was standing still. It was as if your world has stopped and everything is moving at a hyper speed. And I remember laying on the table, and at first I didn't feel the anesthetic. I was awake and I could feel everything. So she began to cut, and I said, wait, I can feel it. And so they gave me another one. The next thing you know, I'm on this cold table. My bleeding is not stopping, but at the same time, my oxygen was very low and my lungs were nearly crackling. And I just remember fading. And I said to my husband, is she healed? And he shook his head. And I remember looking at the hospital light. It's that white, glaring, horrific light that makes everything ugly. And I went up, and I felt myself going up. And I'll never forget this moment where the first time I heard the audible voice of God, and I heard, wake up and fight. And in that moment, I went from feeling this peaceful fading to dropping back into myself. And I kind of did this jerk, even though there were no paddles or nothing on me. And I heard the doctor say, oh, thank God. And I just remember feeling like, okay, I was stabilized. I saw my son. They brought him to me. I saw his little face, and I just remember being numb and cold. And when they put me in the hospital room, I needed a blood transfusion. Now, at the time, they had no NICU. The NICU was supposed to be ready. We anticipated birthing in March. So now my son is in the nursery, which is okay, but my daughter had to be driven down to Westchester. And I'll never forget the moment that they brought her in. And they said that I couldn't touch her. I couldn't hold her. And so I'm getting a blood transfusion, and the ambulance workers come in and they wheel in this clear box, big child-sized box that looked like a coffin almost, but it wasn't. And it had little air things, and she was hooked up to everything. And I looked at her features and I thought, oh, she's so beautiful. I said, Lord, you're going to heal her. You're going to heal her. Even if you didn't heal her yet, I know that you're going to do it. I said, could I hold her? They said, she doesn't have long, she's on oxygen. We got to get her down. I remember I put my little finger, could get in, and I just touched her once, and she was whisked away. And that was the last time I ever saw her. I remember them bringing in, and I was able to hold him, but with a mask because I had pneumonia. And so I had this mask on, and I just, nothing was the way I thought it was going to be. The next day, I was told he had to go to Westchester Medical because he swallowed blood, and they found the blood in his stool, and they wanted to be sure that there was no internal injuries because of the hemorrhaging. But I think it was really when I received the phone call, and he received a phone call, and we just figured it was the mortgage company or somebody trying to tell us whatever, and it wasn't. And I see his face go white, and I said, what is it? And it was the second time that I just saw his face like that, and he slowly took the cup of coffee away from me. He just said, she's gone. And I said, what do you mean she's gone? That's not possible. She can't be gone. God's supposed to heal her. And he said, honey, she's gone. And I just remember saying, no. And so then I began to recall, you know what? Elisha's bones could create life, right? I said, Lazarus. I just was listing all these things. I said, so you know what? No, God could still raise her from the dead. I have faith that God's going to do it. And I was so sure. So I just said, hold her just before you do anything. Don't touch her. Hold on to her for 4 days, because I just remember Lazarus 4 days. I wanted to give every opportunity. All this time I'm thinking, I can't do this. I just remember thinking, I don't think I could do this. In the NICU. He was fine, thank God, but I lost my daughter. And so then it came time for us to be released. My husband was exhausted. He had rings under his eyes. He's driving back and forth an hour and a half each way to Westchester, back and forth, back. And finally, we were allowed to take home. And I remember after all of that, a week later, having to go for my checkup with all the other moms like a normal mother. And I was preparing a funeral, a memorial service, and at the same time, not sleeping. And my husband was getting up as well, of course. But I just felt it was stolen from me, this joyous occasion. And I looked at the doctor, a woman, and I loved her. She was just so beautiful. She's from Africa, and she never smiled, but she was just stunning. But she looked at me, and she was not full of emotion. She was very straight to the point kind of woman. But she looked at me, and her eyes filled with tears. I had never seen that kind of emotion from her, even after she came to see me in the hospital room. And her eyes filled with tears, and she went, I have to tell you something. I said, oh boy, here we go. I said, yes. And she said, I don't think you recognize what happened that day. She said, you were behind the sheet, but I saw it all. I was there delivering. And I've never seen this in all my years of OBGYN. I've never seen this. And I said, what is it? And I was thinking she was going to tell me how bad trisomy 13 was. She said, I want you to know something about trisomy 13 babies. Not only do they usually stop growing in utero and naturally remove themselves, but they don't move if they do live. They stay on their side. You were bleeding. We were sure that we were going to lose all of you and that your husband was going to walk home alone. And tears are streaming down her face. And I'm just thinking, I don't know if I have this bandwidth, Lord, to handle this right now. And she said, your daughter spooned your son. She wrapped her arm around his nose and mouth, and she took the brunt of the blood. And she began to sob at this point. And she said, what I saw you endure. And then she lost it. And she says, you're the strongest woman I know. And now I do believe in miracles. And she hugged me tight. And at this point, I'm broken. And she's telling me that all of this was a miracle. And I couldn't see it. I just said, thank you. And she just said, be strong for your little boy, because I do believe in miracles. I've never seen a trisomy 13 baby with that kind of case move at all or even survive. What she did, I watched it. She saved her brother's life. And all of a sudden, I remember my aunt's story where she says, you know, Nicole, the night that passed, I had a dream. I had a dream that Jesus showed up in that room, and he brought say goodbye because you needed closure. There had to be closure, because that was something I was worried about. Lord, now he's going to feel like he's missing half of his twin. Nobody knew that I felt that way. And there was a picture that we still have that my brother-in-law took of smiling at the exact moment, because when she began to die, he began to cry. And there was this exact timing that all three stories just aligned. But I didn't want to hear it. I said, oh, that's nice. Good. At least there's closure. I was numb. I couldn't receive it. I was mad. I was angry. And I stayed angry for a month. I walked past the room because I remember the baby shower, and I remember getting 2 of everything, and her little girl ruffles and her socks and her little shoes. And I remember I opened the door one day when I felt that still small voice. I was home, was napping, and I was numb. I was checked out, and I felt this urgency to open the door, and I didn't want to. And I heard this still small voice that said, open the door. I don't want to open the door. And I hear, open the door, child. And I said, okay. And I open the door and I see her white crib and her bedding. And there was this like light film of dust. I just traced my finger along, just trying to pretend for a minute that maybe she's out with my mom or she's somewhere else in the house. And the Lord said, it's time to take it down. And I didn't want to. And so I went back out and I closed the door. And I said, I'm not doing anything. And I folded the laundry and I felt that voice again say, how do you feel? And I said, I'm fine. And I felt again, how do you feel? And I lost it. I said, what do you mean how I feel? And I threw the laundry and I threw an epic rage, hormone, everything. How could you let this happen? What kind of God lets this happen? I questioned him. I challenged him. I yelled at him. And at the end of it all, he said, now we can start to heal, my love. And in that moment, I began a journey that I thought I was doing. And finally, in that space where I yelled at God, I unleashed the floodgates of the door to my heart, because the door to her room was a closed door to my heart. And by opening the door to her room, the Lord was challenging me to open my heart to feel the hard feelings towards him that most people don't want to admit they feel, but he could handle it. And it was then and there that I began to try to grieve while I have a colicky son, while I'm trying to manage my own things and healing physically. And then came the disease that was a result of the hemorrhage. And so I found myself, as I'm going through healing, as I'm going through raising a child and finding joy and finding beauty in moments. And then I ended up in a hospital. They didn't know what was wrong with me. And my son was 13 months old at the time. And I recall feeling like I was dying again, and I was triggered. I said, something's not right. They could not figure it out. They didn't know what it was, but my organs were shutting down. And I remember another doctor that I loved. He said, whatever you do, don't let them do exploratory surgery on you. You're not going to make it. There's something else wrong. And I said, okay. And I remember praying as my organs are shutting down. I'm on IV fluid. My husband's taking care of my third. I'm by myself. My mom's trying to visit when she can. She showed up, but I was in bad shape. And then, thank God, a doctor came in, an endocrinologist, and he said, stop everything. He said to everybody, I know what this is. She has Addison's disease, and it came from her hemorrhaging. The adrenal cortex burnt out. And I was wondering why I was always sick, couldn't get better, things didn't work. I was exhausted, infection after infection. That was the reason. And I was told then, after the endocrinologist, he said, let's talk. I was released from the hospital that day, 3 days later, because they gave me steroids. And I was then told that I was going to have to be on steroids the rest of my life because I didn't produce any cortisol, which is a hormone you need to survive, live. So I remember saying, well, I could still have kids, right? Because, we did in vitro, we have embryos, and we're going to put more in, we're going to have more babies. And he looked at me and he went, I'm sorry. And I said, what? What do you mean? And he said, you can't carry any more children, Nicole, you'll die. And I said, that's not possible. That can't be. I earned this. I deserve this. And he said, I know, but your case, you can't. So I went home and we had our babies in storage at that point, and insurance actually covered it for 5 years. So I said, well, 5 years, that's long enough time for me to build my body back up. And if I just work hard enough, if I just push a little, if I pray, I could do this. I could do this. And it didn't happen. I instead had more hospital visits because I went into adrenal crisis several times, nearly died 2 more times. And I thought, Lord, how could you be a God of miracles that you want, but not the miracles that I need? And I remember saying, what do you want me to do? Because we believe life begins at conception. And so I remember a friend of mine offered to be a surrogate, and we were very excited. And so she, believed, and I believed it. We began to pray before we made any decision. We prayed separately, and I kept having these dreams, and I kept feeling like I didn't want to admit it. And she called me up and she said, Nicole. And I said, I already know. She went, I'm just so sorry. And she began to cry. We were like this. And I said, oh, honey, it's okay. At least we were told the same thing. So I said, I don't know what to do then. I guess we'll have to start paying, but it's not right to leave this in limbo. And I didn't want to donate to science. It just didn't feel right. So as I'm typing, I'm writing, and then I was editing for a magazine. I was editing some stuff that was coming in, and I popped on my computer out of nowhere, a Christian or adoption organization for embryos, out of nowhere. So I X'd out and I continued to edit. and I have my glasses on, and I'm, making these edits and doing all these things, having 10 tabs open as you do. It popped up again. And I'm like, I'm not looking, not looking. I don't see it. And finally I said, fine, I'll look. And it was a Christian organization that actually treats embryos like you're adopting them. There's profiles of people that are looking, and it's a wonderful faith-based organization. I began to research, and it was for women who can't have children. And I said, let me get this straight. I lose my daughter. I have this miracle story that I have finally received. I have walked through grief. I've written a book. I've helped others. And now, when I want to have another baby, I can. And now the ones that I have, you won't let me keep. So you're asking me to bless another woman with what I want? You're asking me to bless another woman with my children, my husband's children, my son's siblings. And at that time, he would say, since he was 2 and 3 years old, I miss my sister, mommy, and I have a brother and sister. And I remember thinking, I failed again. And it felt like such a betrayal. But I prayed, and we decided, yes. So I wrote the 25-page profile and did the pictures and the editing. And then there was a hit. There was somebody who matched. And I didn't want to look at the profile. I felt that still small voice say, Nicole, read the profile. And I said, no way. And he said, read the profile. And I read the profile, and there was this young couple. I mean, at that time, I was close to 40. And there they are with their big smiles, hopeful, just like I was, hoping for a miracle. And I knew this was within my power to do for somebody else. I could be the person that I never had. I could give a woman something that she longed for. And I thought, too perfect. And I said, oh, what are these children? Half of my wit and my tenacity and my husband's wit and tenacity. What is that going to look like? And then I had to decide if it was going to be an open or closed adoption. My husband and I talked about it. We didn't know what was going to take and what wasn't. We know we had 7. And I remember saying yes. And they were so excited. And I chose open. And my husband said, you do realize that if any one of these babies takes, there is going to be a child out there that looks like one of us. I said, well, probably you, because I did all the work. I remember thinking, how am I going to look at this child every day knowing, as my son says, can I have a sibling? What am I going to do, Lord? And I said yes, and I chose open. And I remember thinking, I choose open because I want to see him or her. I want to see. It's still my responsibility to love and pray for this child and this family from afar. So I will make it my mission to pray for them. And there was a miscarriage, and we both grieved. Both of our families grieved that loss. And there was another one. And then there was one that took a little girl. I have crazy curly hair, and she has it. And I remember weeping for the first few years of that. But I also remember smiling and sending gifts. And I remember the letter from the parents, because we're in communication, saying, you gave us the greatest gift. Even though we lost them, you gave us the greatest gift. This wildly intelligent, witty, compassionate, that loves animals. Of course, that's a bleeding heart in many ways. And I get to learn and love her from afar until the time comes that maybe someday she knows about me, I know about her, and someday the Lord's going to do it. But I got to be a blessing. I got to give somebody something that they normally wouldn't be able to have. And while my son is not aware of that at this time, someday I'll share. I felt at the end of it all this new compassion, this new strength and resolve to be not just a voice for those who have suffered, but to train people how to deal with the suffering, those who have lost, what to say, what not to say. And that sometimes people could be like Job's friends. They want to come up with a reason for everything. Maybe it's this, maybe that's happened, maybe this is why. But that's not helpful, and it's not edifying at all. Sometimes it's better just to be silent and to weep with those who weep, celebrate with those who celebrate. And it's just that simple. And so throughout those years, I wrote devotionals, real devotionals that were filled with raw feeling of our story, but also tying it in with how to grow through grief. That grief doesn't have to be an end to your story. In fact, it really is another door that you walk through, and you carry it, and there's a compassion that's birthed from loss that allows you to see people through a lens that maybe you didn't see before. I could tell you that I have been as passionate as I always was, even more so in a way that I didn't think possible. There's a strength to grief. There is a faith that gets you through it. And there is a God at the end of it all who can handle your tantrums and handle the hard things